welcome to Becoming, Collaboraction's virtual workshop where we support each other, dismantle oppression, and optimize humanity's potential. How about that? Thank you for sharing your life with us tonight. It's great to see so many people trickling in. Collaboration is a Chicago social change company that uses theater, video, and dialogue to cultivate knowledge, empathy, dialogue, and action to change and dismantle oppressions of all forms. I am Anthony Mosley. I'm Collaboration's artistic director. I am proud to be joined by Dr. Marcus Robinson, Sarah Swift, and Piper, who is behind the curtain tonight, and all of you who have come to become a part of this circle tonight, and therefore give us all a place to connect and grow as we leave our past behind and build a new world together. Is my partner, Dr. Robinson, in the house?
Well, it's great to see you, Anthony. So good to be here tonight, everyone. Thank you so much. Tonight, we're having a special edition of Becoming, and we're taping it and are going to upload tonight's show to our YouTube and Facebook because we feel that this conversation should be had by as large an audience as possible. We'll be exploring Arab Americans and whiteness with special guests Jamil Curry, the artistic director of Silk Road, and Roxane Assag, if I hope I said that correct, and Fouad Teymour. You guys correct me when you get on and get the names right. I'm often, tongue twisted in that way, but nonetheless, with all due respect and love, and we'll be viewing Jamil's film, Not Quite White, Arabs, Slavs, and the Contours of Contested Whiteness. And as you might be aware, that white is actually a pretty new thing for the civilization of humanity. Maybe 400 or 500 years ago, white first got onto made it into literature, only like in the 1600s, really. So what is it, and how is it contested? So we'll get into all of that. And Anthony, man, it's so good to be back on Zoom with you, doing this kind of show, this kind of work. It's good to see you, brother.
You too. A few things we like to remind ourselves before we jump into these conversations. One is that white supremacy is an ideology. It is not a person. It is a social construct, and it only has power if society gives it power. I also want to state that just showing up to something like this is an act of courage and vulnerability. It doesn't matter who you are. These conversations are easier to not have than to have. So thank you for being here. Without you, there wouldn't be much of a conversation. And special thanks to our amazing guests tonight. Another reminder that this is a marathon, it's not a race. We're all in our own place in our journey of understanding white supremacy and dismantling it. And we all started at different spots. And in a way, we're all running in different directions towards a center point. And if change starts with you or with me, it also starts with self-care and wellness. So let's just remind ourselves that agents of change must take care of themselves, or we can't take care of others, especially in this unique time in history. As we are still dragging through a pandemic, let's all give ourselves the grace we need to be our best.
Yeah, absolutely. First rule of a change agent is to survive. That's the prime directive, just survive it. And taking care of ourselves is the way to do that. And to help us take care of ourselves, we've created the Becoming Unlearning White Supremacy Facebook group to keep the dialogue going throughout the month. And we add resources to it. We're in there talking with each other, deepening and expanding our understanding of this work. So go ahead and click on the link that's being dropped into the chat right now and just, say hello just to get started. Yes, and we've also just launched our updated Collabor Activist membership program. You can join the movement for as little as $1 a month to bring us all together and receive all kinds of great benefits like our activist tools, gear, and invites each month to our monthly Collabor Activist Social Hour on the last Friday of each month. All it takes is $1 to get you started.
Okay. Thank you for that, Marcus. Let's go ahead and bring up my friend, our peer company leader, Jamil Curry, also founder of and artistic director of the Silk Road Rising. Hello, Jamil.
Hi, Anthony. I am so honored to be here. Big thanks to you and Dr. Marcus, to the entire Collaboration community. I love the work you do. I applaud the work you do, and it's a privilege to share space with Collaboration and Becoming. We have a lot in common. I think we grapple with a lot of the same issues or adjacent issues, and want to arrive at the same places. So, you know, the work that we do, we're a digital and live theater company, a lot of educational programming that centers Pan-Asian, North African, and Muslim voices. And the piece you're gonna see shortly, Not Quite White, is a short documentary that we made in 2012. And I think it's still as relevant, if not more relevant today. I do want to put one thing out at the very beginning. You're going to hear some Arabic and Polish. So don't freak out if you don't know what these words are. But it speaks to what we address within the film. And this is how complicated our identities are and our relationships to whiteness and not quite whiteness. So
Excellent.
Thrilled to be sharing this work and this space with all of you.
After the screening, we'll be joined by our guests, Roxane and Fouad, and then we'll be opening it up for the audience to ask questions and even turn your camera on and come on stage with us if you so wish. We do this show once a month, and this is a special one. So, Jamil, thank you for sharing this artistic asset with our family. And we are going to be screening it here in Zoom, but we also just put the link in the chat. If you wanted to, you could also run it off of your chat. You know, through the Zoom, it has to go over to Zoom headquarters and then over here. So if there's any quality issues, go ahead and grab that link. And I'm going to give you a minute to grab it and put it in there. And then I'll do a countdown and we can all press play at the same time. I don't suspect there's going to be an issue with Zoom, but you got to back up now. So without further ado, let's go ahead and get ready to watch Not Quite White, Arabs, Slavs, and the Contours of Contested Whiteness in 5, 4, 3, 2, 1.
Nie mogę doczekać się naszego lotu.
O, ja też będziemy miały bardzo długi lot. Chodź, idziemy oddać bagaże.
Dobrze,
بتفكر بدك تطلب؟
كنت بفكر انه بدي لحم غنم وانت؟
لحم غنم طيب كثير، أنا كنت بفكر إنه بدي دجاج مع لبنة.
Whenever I hear people speaking Arabic or a Slavic language, no matter which dialect of Arabic or which Slavic language, it could be in the streets, in a mall, at a restaurant, in an airport, I turn around to see who they are, always. I want to blurt out, hey folks, you may not know this, but hey, I'm one of you. Kind of.
You are not one of us.
Hate to break the news to you, pal, but you're white.
You're like really white.
You don't look like a Jamil.
You're Polish, remember?
This is what an Arab American looks like.
When you're an American with Arab and Slavic blood and an Arabic name and white skin, it makes for some rather interesting conversation and a fair amount of confusion.
Jamil Khoury? You're Arab.
Yes? Well, I'm half Arab.
I never would have guessed. I mean, you look like an American.
Oh, well, I am an American.
I mean, a real American. Your parents, they're from...
My father's originally from Syria. He came to the US back in the 50s. My mother was born in Chicago, of Polish and Slovak heritage.
You look Syrian.
Thank you.
Your eyes. Arab.
The clips you are watching are from my quasi-autobiographical short play, WASP, White, Arab, Slovak, Pole. In writing WASP, I set out to explore my relationship to Arabs and Slavs. And yet, along the way, I ended up exploring the issue of whiteness. So I decided to investigate my race in a documentary, and to speak with others who have also considered what it means to be white in America, and with whom I share Arab and Slavic backgrounds.
I'm a WASP. A white Arab, Slovak, Pole.
Well, I define myself, as, of course, as a white American of Polish descent.
Lebanese, with the diasporic history that extends into Brazil as well.
Identify with the Polish American working class, who were then called ethnics, white ethnics. I also identify with their predecessors, who were not yet white ethnics.
I am a WASP. I am a white Anglo-Spanish Palestinian. My father is from Honduras, where his Palestinian parents went. My mother's half Costa Rican. And the ancestors that came from my mother's side were all Jews. So I'm a white Anglo-Sephardic Palestinian.
Okay. We're playing with acronyms now. Interesting angle.
Semitic Slav, Slavic Semite. Think kibbeh and kielbasa.
You're like all-American white.
Midwest farm boy white.
Chicago cop white.
Isn't racial profiling generally considered a bad thing?
In this country, being born white is like hitting the jackpot.
You won the lottery, boyfriend.
Whiteness is... It's like membership without the application process. An automatic upgrade to first class. Instant access to the secret code.
Whiteness has a persistence to it. There's no doubt. Whiteness has legs. It's the trusted brand, the market leader. And there are many people, both in the United States and around the world, who wish they were white. Is this wish political, material, aesthetic, or is it something else?
Whiteness as a category ultimately has no objective basis. It is about power, ultimately.
Whiteness is a constructed identity that benefits some and doesn't benefit others. Whiteness precedes and sort of qualifies one as fully American.
Jamil, is it true that Arabs are considered Caucasian?
Yes, I call it white without the benefits.
Good thing you've got that Slavic blood to fall back on.
Not exactly. Poles, Serbs, Russians. We Slavs were banished to the outer reaches of the white stratosphere eons ago.
Jamil, are you saying that Anglo-Saxons the real deal?
No Slovaks or Polacks on the Mayflower, that's for sure.
Maybe whiteness did find its ideal mate in Anglo-Saxon Protestants, or at least non-poor Anglo-Saxon Protestants. But when whiteness hooked up with Arabs and Slavs, the courtship turned rocky. The same can be said about the Irish, the Italians, the Greeks, the Jews. Whiteness plays favorites.
The first wave of European immigrants were mostly from Northern and Western Europe. They had an easier assimilation than people with names that you couldn't pronounce like mine. And so there was a clash right from the very beginning.
Southern and Eastern European immigrants, as a larger group, were not considered white when they first arrived. Historians, sociologists around ethnicity will refer to the category pigs: Poles, Italians, Greeks, and Slavs. These groups were considered racially inferior. They were not white, but they were also not African American. So they benefited from racial apartheid, but they also were not considered white.
Finally, in the 1920s, immigration from Europe was cut off, basically to stop these Eastern and Southern Europeans from coming into the country.
Arabs maintain an honorary white status. We can selectively claim whiteness when it benefits us, and we occasionally are as well stripped of whiteness, sometimes arbitrarily.
We've been struggling to be seen as white people because white people are winners, and to quote, "Don't back no losers," which is to say that Arabs would get in the winning line, which was to be white. So why would you identify with anything less than what would make you and your children the most successful Americans you could possibly be?
When Arabs came in the late 19th century and early 20th century, they themselves had really no prior understanding of race. They didn't think of themselves in racial terms. Arabs as a group drew a lot of scrutiny from U.S. American elites because U.S. Americans didn't know how to define Arabs, racially speaking. And so Arabs were claiming whiteness because in order to gain U.S. citizenship, one had to be a white person in good moral standing or of African nativity. When they applied for citizenship, in several cases in the early 20th century, they were denied on the basis that they were of Asiatic birth. And so there was a concerted effort on the part of Syrian immigrant elites to hire lawyers, consult with scientists to try to prove their whiteness. They would say, well, Arabs are white because we come from a part of the world that Jesus came from. Therefore, is Jesus not white? And in many of these cases, they quote unquote won.
Eventually, Slavs and Arabs were afforded whiteness, but it was a qualified whiteness, a conditional whiteness. They were not quite white. White with an asterisk, aspiring whites, acclimating whites, honorary whites, titular whites, in-between whites, transitioning whites, not quite yet fully almost sort of whites.
It was believed that the new immigrants were too dirty, too foreign, either too Catholic or too Jewish, depending on which group they were talking about, well-suited to manual labor, perceived as docile, too ignorant to ever fully be assimilated into the racial superiority of Northern and Western Europeans. I found one sociological study that claimed that Slavs are immune to certain kinds of dirt, that they could, quote, stand what would kill a white man.
There's a wonderful book by Madison Grant called The Passing of the Great Race, in which he warns that the Jews and the Poles and the Slovaks and all are going to intermarry with white Anglo-Saxon Protestant women and destroy the Anglo-Saxon race. I understand Hitler enjoyed the book quite a bit himself and had it translated.
It's fascinating to me how two groups as seemingly different as Slavs and Arabs have both experienced white racism while ostensibly being white themselves. And this official classification of Arab Americans as white does carry a bitter irony. The relentless persistence of anti-Arab and anti-Muslim racism in this country does not see white.
Arabs confronted this sort of biracial order within the United States in the first half of the 20th century. The case is the lynching of Nola Rumni, this Syrian in Florida. This was the Jim Crow South. Him and his wife began talking to an officer as if they were equals. The officer obviously did not view them as equals. And so when this white police officer saw this Syrian, this foreigner, talking back to him, the Syrian man ended up lynched.
My own heritage has been spelled back to me in a way that's completely fraudulent. The mainstream news media coming out from the day that we were all born, my generation, indicating that Palestinian is synonymous with terrorist. The two words married very naturally because of the way that the story is constantly told in the mainstream news media. It was almost cartoonish. So it really wasn't until I started hanging out with a Middle Eastern person that I learned, quite to the contrary, U.S. foreign policy is endorsing a racist apartheid system to keep the Palestinians completely suppressed.
تحكي عربي. You must speak Arabic, ya Jamil.
Oh, I know. I understand Arabic way better than I can speak it. Hell, I don't know a word of Polish or Slovak.
Why would you?
In many ways, whiteness tells Arabs and Slavs to stop being Arabs and Slavs.
American mainstream culture has awarded white ethnics white status, and partially through trade-offs on the part of the group, sometimes willingly abandoning their names, their language.
I was raised in a family that was Spanish-speaking on both sides of the family. My parents had 8 children who were not encouraged to speak Spanish. A house full of barefoot people speaking Spanish, not cool. It wasn't the surest way to become financially successful or socially successful.
You know, some of these American-born Arabs, they never go home. They're lost. They want to be more American than the Americans.
Yeah. It's the whole assimilation thing. They kind of screwed it up.
I see World War II really as a big assimilating event. People went off being Polish and Lithuanian and German and Irish and Bohemian. They came back Americans. And also as people's worlds widened, they began to intermarry with other groups, began to see other things. And of course also of being assimilated into the bad parts of being American. To become American and white is to become racist. That's part of the assimilation process. The Poles begin to realize, like, wait a minute, to become American is to know that blacks are to be kept away from, blacks are to be kept out of your neighborhood. To become American, to be accepted, is to make that separation.
Arabs are victims of racism and victimizers as well. Instead of allying with African Americans, with Asians, Arabs threw everyone else under the bus, said, okay, we're not like you, we want to be like the whites. That is, in order to become American, that immigrants must adopt racism against blacks.
You've got Polish Americans participating in the Trumbull Park riots in the 1950s. You've got Polish Americans participating in the Market Park riots in the 1960s. Like all so-called white Americans, they reacted to integration. Why? The American dream is one of upward mobility. They had just crawled up to the middle class status, and here came the blacks. And there were arguments between the black community over jobs, housing, and politics. Watch these blacks, because you want to crawl over them to the top.
There's this very interesting triangulation where the white ethnic knows that they are in a different social position than the African American who's despised, but they also know that they're despised as white ethnics.
There's nothing inherently about Arabs that would have them hate other peoples of color, but it's a world that was colonized by Europe. We're all put on different rungs of the ladder, and Arabs claim that they're on a higher rung and therefore adopt a racism against others in order to maintain their own position.
There was no special gene for bigotedness in Slavic people, but the Polish joke in maligning Slavs did other work. By having a compressed cultural category that quickly can point out as a marker, this group is bigoted, backwards, uneducated, that actually shifts the attention from the larger racial politics of the culture and says the racism in this culture isn't really found in the structure of the culture that reproduces and maintains white supremacy and inequality. The real problem of racism is to be found in those backward Polacks, who, as we all know, are bigots. It said that the problem with especially urban racism was white ethnics, not the people who profited from real estate deals and redlining.
Is it true you consider yourself a race traitor?
I've always felt like an imposter at the white party.
Party's about to end, white boy.
A poser. A gatecrasher.
Don't even try playing that game.
Stealth brownie in whiteface.
One day, being white will command the premium that it does now.
Do I consider myself a person of color? Do I look like a person of color? My husband Malik, he's a person of color. Now I understand why for some people it's important or even strategic to describe me as a person of color. As a political stance, I get it, I'm there. But as an aesthetic or experiential descriptor, I feel like I'm being dishonest.
Being born and raised in New Orleans, Louisiana, I was most certainly raised to think of myself as white. The fact that there was this Palestinian stripe was an odd color nobody quite knew what to do with. And then when inventions of social distinction like brown come around, you sort of measure yourself against that, and that's what I found myself doing. I was a white person that always had the feeling that I didn't quite fit that description, but I didn't know why. I started to identify as a brown person, and quite proudly so. I found that certain members of my family didn't appreciate my referencing myself as brown, because if you get away from being brown, then you should be glad, and then celebrate the fact that you didn't have to be in that pool of suffering. Be glad, and then run with it. But I never understood that. I understood myself as being now a member of a community of brownness that gave me a sense of belonging, a sense of place, a sense of community.
I identify myself as a person of color, but I recognize as well that I benefit from white privilege that I personally hadn't fought for or claimed, but that previous generations of Arab immigrants to this country had fought for.
From the standpoint of Arabs, I can certainly understand why it was at one time very important to identify as white. But there was a cynical turn when the census came out and it was possible to lobby for a change in access to social services on some level that comes with being a member of a minority. And so check it right, you ain't white became the rallying cry for Arab Americans. It was certainly a shift in the consciousness to a more utilitarian approach to whiteness or non-whiteness.
Arab Americans today want to claim an identity as people of color, but without acknowledging the fact that we've selectively benefited from white privilege. And today, it's easier to identify with other peoples of color. The Jim Crow era has ended. The explicitly anti-Asian immigration policy ended.
In the history of creating the category of whiteness, some of that history has been forgotten and covered over, and I don't want to forget that. Poles and Slavs generally were highly involved in the labor movements, in the fight for working justice, in very bold ways when you consider how much an immigrant had to lose, and put their lives on the line and sometimes lost their lives.
I think one thing that happens with Americans, especially Americans of, let's say, the second or third generation, you have an emptiness, a yearning, a sense of community that is not there, that you yearn for. Sometimes I think if only I could go back to Babka's Green Kitchen, I could be warm and safe again.
Nie mogę doczekać się naszego odlotu.
O, ja też. Będziemy miały bardzo długi lot. Chodź, idziemy oddać bagaże.
شو بتفكر بدك تطلب؟
كنت بفكر
إنه بدي لحم غنم
oddaję jedną walizkę.
لحم غنم طيب كثير، أنا كنت فكر إنه بدي دجاج مع لبنة. يلا نروح هذا المحل نشوف لو نلاقي شيء نشتري لأحمد.
Ultimately, we're all not quite white. We're all failed whites because whiteness lies to white people, and it especially lies to poor whites. Because whiteness defines us in opposition to the very polycultural world in which we actually exist. In a few decades, there will be no ethnic or racial majority in the United States. We will all be minorities. And frankly, that America already exists. I live in that America.
I do feel like a genuine American in the fact that I'm a blend. And Americans do use the expression melting pot often enough. So I'd like to identify what is American as what is our best selves. And so being their best would be people who would stand up for the underdog.
Slowly but surely, we keep redefining the American Revolution to be inclusive and inclusive and inclusive. So now, women have the right to vote, African Americans have the right to vote, and people from China can become naturalized citizens, people from Nigeria can become naturalized citizens. We're now giving gay people rights. That's a redefinition of the American Revolution. We redefine the American Revolution every time we have a new generation. And I tell my students, you have to redefine it next. It's your job now. My job is over. I'm in my 60s. I'm done.
Not Quite White. What a wonderful film.
Yes,
Opening
bravo.
up this conversation, yes.
Let's bring everybody up. Come on up, Jamil. Come up, Roxane, Fouad, and let's start with their insights and reflections from the film. Oh my, what a unique point in history that we are all sharing right now. Roxane, what's on your mind? What would you like to share with us tonight as we get this thing started?
Well, it's been interesting to see this again for the first time in years, 2012, wow. But I agree with everything I said before. It really does reflect my experience, the multi-textured way that you come through life in the United States as a multi-ethnic person. The piece about Asia, right? Can we still say that we're out of the woods for anti-Asian hate? But things have happened in the interim, so we need to speak to that with honesty. But what I've gotten into in the last few years has been a responsibility and a weight at the same time, realizing that the people who have committed themselves to Black Lives Matter bring this passion to the cause of Palestinian liberation. And that's something that I came to late in life because I was too busy enjoying my white privilege to really stop and realize that half of my ethnic heritage was being besmirched. So, that alignment with the cause of Palestinian liberation just makes so much sense. But at the same time, does it? Because there are already people in a very vulnerable position. And you do yourself no favors by hanging out with the Palestinian cause. It could put you on a lot of really bad lists. So, but it's not such a new thing as that. You have the Black Panther Party, Angela Davis, Malcolm X, a little bit murky with the introduction of the notion of the Nation of Islam, because then you get into religion, and it really was always simpler than that. It was always oppression, aggression, marginalization at the hands of the white dominant. So, and it was based on your birth. It was based on your color, your ethnicity, your nationality, things that you couldn't have anything to do with if it's, based on where you were born or the skin in which you were born. So
So yeah, and then that moves on to how obvious it is why the boycott, divest, sanction movement, the BDS movement, found it so legitimate to use apartheid South Africa as a model. Because again, you're speaking to the virtuous quest to shake off the white oppressor. And it's good that in the West, we have such an appreciation for the badness of apartheid, because then that's an easy overlay. Even if people have a tendency to reject BDS, you can't get away from that. So again, the dominant form comes to play even in Israeli culture, in Israeli society. The Israeli Jewish hierarchy, the white European at the top, the Jew who settled in Palestine coming from Western Europe. So they took the reins of power and in typical fashion began to oppress the natives.
Well, yes, so much there.
Unpack that.
Well, thank you for laying that all out there. I want to give Fouad an opportunity to lay it out there too, and then we'll start to unpack, unravel, and taste some of this. Fouad, your thoughts?
Well, beautiful. I saw this when it first came out in 2012, and I saw it again this past week, watched it again, and I am experiencing it a lot differently, but I'm learning a lot from it. Personally, I came to the issue a little later than Roxane and Jamil. I was not born here. I was born in Egypt. I came to the US in the early 80s for studies, for graduate studies, got my PhD at the University of Wisconsin. And at the time, I really didn't think of that issue. I mean, we were activists in a lot of other things, but not specifically in the issue of whiteness or racism. It was not something we thought about. When I was first asked to fill out forms, I saw boxes to check, and I didn't really know what do I do here. I never thought of myself as white. As Jamil said, we were taught that we are Caucasian all along. And for us, it was just a word. You're Caucasian. Okay, fine, Caucasian. So we started using that. But it took many, many years for me to in a sense, I actually have been educated over the last 40 years and started knowing a lot more about things. And this movie actually, even now, I'm watching this and I'm getting educated on things I didn't have to think about. The fact that there were Syrians who were trying, to be claimed as white because that would give them an advantage.
Yes.
Right. On the other hand, in the last couple of decades, I know of cases of Egyptians who tried the opposite, who tried to be claimed as African American because then they can get something out of that, and that is equally problematic to be trying to do that because and the guy was saying, I'm from Africa, I was born in Africa, and yes, I am African, North African. But this thing, changes with time. For me, the most pivotal realization happened after 9/11.
And say more about that.
Yeah, so it's the opposite of what you might think. The problem I face is that people that I hadn't talked to in a long time, who don't live here or outside, were calling me and saying, "Oh, you must have been suffering. Things must have become really bad for you." And then it was like, no, not really. I mean, I have not had to endure anything, but I know of people who have been harassed on the streets and other places, but no, I really have not had to deal with anything. And I had to think to myself, why is that? And part of the answer in my mind was, I'm living in Chicago, big city, it's a different environment, I'm in academia, and I'm sure all of this contributed to it, but also the part of passing as white is part of it that I really never thought about, and I never identified it like that. For me, I came in as an Egyptian. I'm now an Egyptian American, and I didn't have to think about all those things throughout. But it made me realize that no, that's not how I identify. I don't identify as white. But do I really need to be going out, and doing something? In the last couple of years, I've been telling people that I want to start a hashtag, not a white male, and on social media. And there was one time when we were together, a few playwrights, after reading, and we're having pizza and drinks and things like that. And then I said that, and some of my friends were like, "Fouad, that's nonsense. You are white," And I was like, "No, really," and tried to explain things. But then I realized that by doing this, there is the other side of it, is that I could be antagonizing white people, and there really is no problem with white people, nice, sweet white people. Just like Anthony said at the top, it's white supremacy that is the problem. Mm-hmm. So, but then there is a huge sea of people who are white and getting the white privilege, but they don't really realize it. And it is a fluid situation. We don't know where it's going to end up, but we're all learning, we're all improving. That's the hope.
Wow. That's as honest and authentic as it gets. We are all in the soup learning. We're all getting benefits. We don't know where they came from. We're all running from the oppression of that stuff. Yeah. And if we could find some solidarity, maybe come together on some of this stuff, maybe we can disrupt this thing. But Jamil, it's now been a minute since you produced that piece, and having the hindsight being 2020, what do you see now?
Well, once again, I think it's unfortunate that it is as relevant, or if not more than when we first made it. But I do think that we have seen, certainly in Arab American circles, we can talk more broadly, Middle Eastern American circles, a heightened consciousness around these questions: the question of white privilege, the question of complicity, and how anti-Blackness has played a role in identity formation in many respects, and in that Americanizing journey, and people being, accountable and held accountable and holding themselves accountable to that legacy of not only privilege, but a certain denial, and as was referenced in the film by John Karam, essentially throwing communities under the bus. And I think there's a lot of unlearning that's been taking place, and Arab Americans now very consciously and strategically and genuinely aligning themselves with anti-white supremacist politics. And that being a shift, that is obviously, we can talk about, we talk a lot about the racial reckoning since the murder of George Floyd. And I think that we can go all the way back to, as Fouad was referencing, to 9/11, and this period where people had to start really confronting who we are in this American rubric, who we are within the broader American story, and seeing ourselves and feeling ourselves being so utterly despised and feared and spoken of as an existential threat, as a fifth column, as a security concern for the country, not to be trusted, not to be, in any way given benefit of the doubt. So all of that has converged to, into a sea change and of attitude and activism and commitment and priorities and so forth. And it's always unfortunate that it takes tragedy to be the catalyst, but these are tragic conversations, and these are tragic realities, and these are tragic, this is a tragic history, and we are beginning to own a lot of the ugliness in that history. And I think it's allowing us to mature as communities and to think coalitionally, to think polyculturally, that it's about the interchange, it's about the connection, it's about
the fact that our cultures are not static, they're not etched in stone. They're always evolving, and they're evolving in communication, in relationship with one another. And that when we talk about, Black and Arab, or when we talk about Korean and Black, we don't have to frame this only as, these contentious relationships, based on, retail businesses or this, that, or the other, that these can actually be relationships. Yeah, rooted in solidarity and rooted in common cause. And I find that very encouraging.
And Jamil, you brought up something very personal. I know I got into the bigger political sphere with my opening remarks, but bringing it down to just my own personal experience outside of taking advantage of white privilege, after 9/11, having my last name and having lived in Palestine as a journalist and political activist, it was special at the airport. I was always randomly picked to stand out from the line and get behind a curtain so ladies could put their hands on me.
And that was just one of the places where it was tangible. It was happening everywhere, probably, your last name.
Absolutely.
Yeah, I definitely want to bring Anthony into this conversation along with the rest of the folks that are sitting out here in our audience, in the Zoom audience with us. But I would be remiss, since you've mentioned it at least twice, maybe 3 times, that that little swoosh that Amazon has from A to Z. There's 9/11 2001 to 9/11 2021 that looms large in the kind of the news of the day. It would be remiss of us not to have some conversation with regard to what's happening there now in Afghanistan, and that group of Arab immigrants that are coming towards us, coming into our communities. I wonder how you feel about that. What are your thoughts on that? How does this really connect to the work that you now know that we need to do together to make this good for all of us? Your thoughts, please.
Is that for Anthony?
That's for Roxane, Roxane, Fouad, or Jamil, and then Anthony, and bring the rest of the folks up too. I don't care.
Sure.
Yeah,
Well,
I'm putting a message in the chat. If anyone has any questions, they want to put it in the chat. And if you'd like to come on camera, we'd all love to see you, and you could turn your video on and join us. Roxane?
Yeah, well, Marcus Robinson just mentioned immigrants in general, and so we're now speaking about non-Arab immigrants, if we're talking about people who come from Afghanistan. And there is this groundswell of more sophisticated politics, I think, with people recognizing the responsibility that we have to the people who are left high and dry without options, that fought our ugly, nasty war. So I want to turn it over to others, but I just wanted to make sure that we don't just focus on Arab things or Middle Eastern or Palestinian causes in my particular focus, but also Latin Americans and their struggle, and just the militarization of police around the nation and cities all over this country. So yeah, I'd like to hear your responses to that as well.
But on the immigrant issue, yes, Afghanistan is going to be a saga that we have to deal with. But for the last 5 years, we've been dealing with the Syrian immigrants in Europe and the US and everywhere. And Iraqis before that were displaced, and so many people. And it all has to do with the remnants of colonialism that have left behind, and trying actually to, the world is fixing itself. The world is trying to fix itself. Every time that a breath of a democratic thing happens, there's always ways of snuffing it and going around it. But over time, things are improving. And during that time, there will be people that need to find other places just until they can protect their families in certain ways and going back. So it's happening. I mean, it's been happening forever.
And how astounding that the Tucker Carlsons of the world, within days of the beginning of this, mass evacuation, were sounding the alarm bells about, the Afghans who will be living in your neighborhood, possibly next door to you, and just rehashing all of this kind of 9/11 ugliness about, the fifth column, the security threat, they're going to kill you, they're going to, and, they haven't been vetted, we don't know the secrets, all of that. And I think that, it's been very difficult to watch the scenes from Afghanistan in the past few weeks. But this is a continuation of the story that we've been telling, and a new group of immigrants who are going to face, are entering into a bit of a civil war within the U.S. and unfortunately are going to be, I fear, are going to be targeted in really horrible ways.
We have a guest. Hello, Nasreen. You've joined us. Thank you for coming. And then it looks like we also have Aaron, who would like to come up next after Nasreen. Did you have a question or a comment? And you're on mute right now.
I'd like to thank the panelists, and I've seen this before. I looked at it with totally new eye. It speaks to me as a Persian Arab background with a contested religion in the Middle East. I'm also Baha'i. That makes things even more complicated in terms of identity. But I'm just like the rest of you, found myself in the brownness of the scheme of things, and very comfortable there. In addition to being contested by white people, we also, in many cases, regardless of how genuine our feeling, our identity as people of color, also contested by people of color, because they still see the privilege and are not always comfortable with us claiming to be of color, regardless of how we feel inside. I have been thinking through a lot of this work that has been done is, what role can we play as Arab Middle Eastern? And I feel like genuine being allies and being able to take the message back to our community from our perspective, understanding them, understanding their struggle, their identity conflict in so many cases, probably the best role we can play. Because I personally have failed in being fully accepted as a person of color. I think I'm okay, people accept me more or less with brownness. But I feel like the best role I can play is seriously thinking about this whole issue of allies and cultural informant who can take this understanding of the issue from the inside into their community and bringing their community abroad. Because I think, as you all know, within the Arab community, we still have a lot of work to do.
Yes, thank you for that, Nasreen. Aaron, welcome to the stage.
Thank you. Thank you so much. And thank you to all the panelists and everyone putting this on, and Jamil especially. Just seeing the video, it was just an amazing thing to be able to see experiences I've had, captured on the screen and someone else articulating them, when it is this kind of weird in between experience that there's not often a vocabulary for a lot of times. As you can probably guess by my name, I'm someone who also falls in that not quite white category, and have had similar experience of someone being, oh, you're not really Arab, or you don't look Arab. And then a week later, someone speaking to me in Arabic, and then being surprised that, oh, you're actually an American. So yeah, navigating that, which category do I fit in? Am I white? Am I not? And one thing that struck me in listening to the discussion tonight is the question of how to ethically manage that line of, being on the margins and not quite fitting in any of these categories. I know it's something I've struggled with a lot of times. And just to try and quickly share a couple of anecdotes to illustrate it, I was in a professional development seminar one time, and a woman of a Puerto Rican background came up to me and was like, "Your last name is Arabic." And I'm like, "Yeah, I'm part Lebanese." She's like, "Oh, I was so happy. I went home and told my husband last night, I'm not the only non-white person there." And I was kind of unsure of how to respond because, I didn't want to sort of disclaim it and be like, "Oh no, I'm white." At the same time, I feel like, but it's very different experience I've had living with white privilege than someone whose parents are immigrants, who's Latinx, Hispanic, grew up in a Spanish speaking household. So I'm always trying to navigate that, like, yes, I am, no, I'm not. And I really appreciated the previous comments about allyship, because that's something that I've thought a lot about is how do you, as Arab American, as not quite white, how do you navigate that space of, on the one hand, there's part of me that kind of wants to disrupt whiteness and push back against the assumptions that I am just white. On the other hand, I don't want to lose sight of the fact that I do have white privilege in very real ways that make my experience very different than many of the people that, maybe more easily fit into that category of person of color. So I'd just be interested in any thoughts about, navigating those kind of tensions and, what are the most productive or liberatory ways that we have to do that.
Aaron, that's such a beautifully put question. I really appreciate the anecdotes and the narrative that you use to describe the situation. So I would respond in 2 points really quickly, and that is, there's no harm in having some privilege. Ain't no harm.
You share it.
Enjoy it and share it widely. All right, that's the key of it. If you got some, share some. Right, no matter who you are, if it's class privilege, if it's education privilege, if it's skin privilege, blah 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 privilege. If you got some, share it with those who have the least of it in your space. And then the second thing I would say, if you really want to disrupt white supremacy, whiteness I'm cool with. White supremacy I'm not cool with. All right. So you want to disrupt white supremacy? Abstain from anti-blackness. Just don't participate in it. That black hate black, the worst, the best black is worse. I mean, let me see. The worst white is better than the best ever black you could ever have. That's the epitome of the whole thing. That's how the thing works. The worst white person is better than the best white person, no matter what. Don't buy it. Don't do any harm. And by any of the anti-blackness, okay, you drive them crazy. And then share your privilege widely with those who don't have it, which is to say, look out for the other one. Like that. If you do those two things, oh my goodness, we're well on our way to transforming our world. And if not our world, certainly the United States of America.
I mean, I think I agree, but I also think we really need to go beyond that if we're gonna present change. There is a great clip where Joy DeGraw talk about her sister-in-law and standing up for oppression and standing up for racism. I think it's time for us not to just not be racist, but to also stand up to racism.
Anti-racism, yeah, you bet.
And to be anti-racist from within.
You bet.
If we have the privilege to be labeled white, regardless of what we think, then we need from within this whiteness rise to show resistance to it. And I think that's the only way we can disrupt it. We cannot disrupt it by remaining silent.
Nesreen, you're so spot on. If you add those three things together, those three components, stand up against racism as you see it, no matter where it happens, do no harm, anti-Blackness stuff, and to share your privilege widely. I would take a vacation there tomorrow if I could go to a place was doing that.
And if you have proximity to whiteness, as Jamil does, you have a special entree and perspective that you can then talk to white people about. And that's what's so great about this film. I always say any piece of art is only as good as the artist's willingness and ability to share themselves. And by making this film and this play, Jamil has really opened up his dilemma, his struggle, and has created space for other people. We have Luca here, one of an old school becoming trailblazer. Luca, welcome.
Hey, Anthony, thank you so much.
And we have one more room for somebody. We could have a nice 3 by 3 foot square if somebody else wants to come up and join us here. Luca, please.
I would absolutely love for someone to follow this, but I just wanted to say thank you so much again for holding all the space. I have so much love for collaboration. I always feel so lucky to get to hear Anthony and Marcus talk, but the film was really, really intriguing to me. This is not my personal lived experience. I'm an Italian American, and it's very, very interesting to me, the question that was being interrogated. And I just wanted to hear a little bit more from the panel, because again, this is my lived experience. That I really loved the interrogation of what whiteness was, of what white culture is fundamentally. And that answer that I believe one of the interviewees had, which was that being American, all being American was being anti-Black. I found that really, really fascinating. That idea that that's all, and possibly it sparked in my head, is that just whiteness? Is that what a white identity or white culture is? I have my white friends arguing, like, what is white culture? Like, it's a casserole in the Midwest. Like people don't really know, that's very amorphous. And so it's just interesting. I'd love to hear what you believe contributes to that, or if that concept doesn't even really exist. I hope what I'm working through here makes some sense. It's just some questions I was really left with.
Well, it goes back to that notion of the winners writing history. They control the narrative. And so they prescribe that narrative as the received wisdom. And so people who have a tendency to, be like most people and want to be accepted, they go with the flow. And so, I had my come to Jesus moment, if you will, as a college professor, when I won some money to do something. And I wanted to win some money and I wanted to do something. But then when I had to do the thing, I was like, oh my goodness, I'm not up to this. And it was an infusion grant. So I had to do this diversity infusion. And suddenly I was extremely self-conscious about the possibility that I was going to take this tried and true syllabus that I do very handily and get these marvelous student evaluations every year and do this overlay. And the overlay was going to seem fraudulent. And I just didn't want to be that fakey person who speaks to racism or marginalization in this kind of pat way. So I think it was a good first go, but I feel like there's some layering and some better indoctrination that I have to do on myself. So you ask a very searching question.
No, thank you. I really hear that. I appreciate that insight. Thank you.
I want to talk about a topic that I heard a couple of times. Nesreen was talking about it a little earlier, which is about getting pushed back if she tries to identify as a person of color. And some of us are saying, if I'm white, do I continue to enjoy that white privilege, things like that. And one thing I want to add is that the situation is a little bit different in theater and in art, because we are not identified by which way do we look, but by the work that we are producing and the things that we are getting involved in. And I noticed that just last year, it has become much easier to say I am a BIPOC artist because a new word has come, and it's more accepted. And So now the floor is open for us to do work. And Jamil, for example, you did this work a decade ago. It's still relevant today. There's a lot of work that is coming out that is really addressing these things and identifying us in those things.
I want to add something in terms of work that's happening in the theater community, and particularly in the West Asian, North African, or Middle Eastern, North African, however you want to describe that. By the way, Middle East is a contested category or a label because of its colonial associations. So we have had these convenings at Silk Road, at the Lark, at Golden Thread, where something really quite extraordinary within an let's say, Middle Eastern, context happens. And that is that Arabs and Turks and Persians and Israelis and Kurds and Armenians are all in the same room. And we are listening to each other's stories, and we are creating stories together. And we are told that we are supposed to hate each other. And yet we love each other in so many cases, and we want to work together and collaborate. So it's been really extraordinary to be in those spaces where we find this new commonality, if you will, or this connectivity that allows us to cast off those kind of predetermined rivalries or enmities that are supposed to exist between us. And then we can replicate that on a much broader scale. But the fact that theater makers have been able to create this space of healing. And once again, I mean, sitting in a room with Turkish theater artists watching a play about the Armenian genocide, which, the country of Turkey officially denies. This did not happen. And agreeing with it and supporting it and amplifying it and associating themselves with it is, Israeli theater artists working with Palestinian theater artists, so forth, across these divides, for me it's revolution. It is evidence that we don't have to play by the script, or that we can in fact rewrite the script. And I think that is happening in America in so many beautiful ways. And I think that's why there's such unbelievable pushback against it, because it's so threatening and because it's so powerful and scary for any number of people.
This is so beautiful and so wonderful to hear. And I know there is so many different spaces where this is happening, this coexistence, this even more than coexistence, this collaboration is happening and creating like common understanding of issues and sympathy. But we have the reality of our communities, and this reality is not similar to what you described, and the contention that happened between these few that you have mentioned, and like I said, as a Persian Arab, with some Palestinian roots too in the mix, to see these communities dislike, and putting it lightly, the Persians and the Arabs dislike for each other is heartbreaking. And I get caught in the mix all the time, with I come from like a Persian background that is rooted in Zoroastrianism, so I'm as Persian as they come. But because I speak Persian with an accent, I lived all my life in Jordan. Well, that's since 82. I lived in 82, just like Fouad. But Persians will point derogatively, look at me as an Arab and say, well, you're an Arab, Shuma Arabi, and I have to fight that constantly. So, I love hearing the positive things, but then I would like the discussion to go to how can we take these positive experiences and start real activism within our communities to disrupt these.
Bring them to the theater. That always works.
idea.
It really always works.
You know, and that is, I think that's a perfect question. We're running out of time. What I'd like to do, Nesreen, thank you so much for joining us.
Thank you.
And you were the first one here. You came early and saw our
Because I am
conference.
in Orlando, that's why I came an hour.
Oh, you're in Orlando. Well, thank you for
Right
joining.
now.
And I'd like to give our guests a chance to answer that question and share any final thoughts or words. Nesreen, thank you so much for joining us. Fouad, you go ahead. Theater's, you're a playwright.
Yes.
Theater is a special place. Expound, please.
So I really like what Nasreen was saying, because in the community, there are people who have very different opinions and arguments. And I argued things with people outside of the theater, but when they came to the theater and saw what we were doing, the argument was a little easier to think about, because now they're seeing it on stage, they're seeing real stories, and we can talk. So my final thought is we should really celebrate diversity, that instead of fighting it. And I know that a lot of people, especially young people, are very sensitive to when people ask them, where are you from? And where are you really from? And they start really cringing back. I actually like it when people ask me that question. I'd love to tell them my whole story and my background, and because I'm proud of what I am. At the same time, Roxane in the movie talks about being a blend, and that thing, being a blend, is something that fascinates me. So I personally go and ask people, where are you? I stopped doing this because it irritates them, but I really like it. I'm fascinated by it. I'm a researcher who works on things where I look at the roots of complexity in systems with singular interaction, things like that. So I really like it. We should celebrate it rather than shy away from it.
Well, look at the lives that had to be lived for the five of us to be here right now.
So true. That's so
beyond
true.
a miracle that we would even be alive, never mind connecting, talking into computers, and having a discussion with people around the country and the world. Roxane, where do you answer that question? What are your final thoughts?
Thank you, Anthony. Well, there's always somebody who's worse off than you. And there's some part of human nature that unfortunately takes advantage of that. It can be soothing to the soul to know, well, I'm not the worst off. So if it's any consolation to you, Nasreen, when there was a lot of bad news in the news about Palestinians and the Palestinian-Israeli conflict, my mother, who was more politically astute than anyone in the house, started instructing her 6 at the time children to start identifying ourselves as Jordanian. So I know you come from Jordan now. That means that being Jordanian was preferable to being Palestinian. But I agree, that whole idea of embracing diversity is a celebration of the variety that we bring. And I try to impart that to my 94-year-old father, who still laments that question. He becomes nervous and defensive when people want to know why his last name is Assaf, and he looks Arab, but he speaks with a Spanish accent. And he came from a family that, unlike much of my extended Palestinian family, who did lose their lives and livelihoods and home lives in Palestine, in al-Nakba, in the takeover of 1948 for the creation of State of Israel. My immediate family has a different story. They were opportunists in Latin America. So when my father's parents came from Jerusalem and Bethlehem and settled in Honduras, they were called Turcos because for 400 years, the Ottoman Empire ruled Palestine and much of that whole region. So being called a Turco was an ethnic slur. And then he lived in Mexico City as his mother got the kids out and moved on to New Orleans. So settling in the United States, he was called a greaser because they thought he was Mexican. So he has this sequence, this overlay of ethnic trouble, and he can't embrace that. So it's funny, you can teach an old dog new tricks. I'm still working on my father to love it when people want to ask the question, because he doesn't do well with that question of where are you from? And he tends to make up stories. So we have good stories. Let's just tell them.
Yes.
Well, we're all in the business of storytelling and representation and expanding representation and challenging and you know, deconstructing and subverting representation. So I think that is so much a part of it. You know, it's the imagery, it's finding oneself in someone else's story, it's being able to find that common ground. You know, we oftentimes will say diversity is our strength, and we kind of leave it at that. And I don't think we can leave it at that, because diversity is not necessarily our strength if we're all in silos or if we are all somehow pitted against each other. Diversity can be a real weakness. So it is how we leverage diversity. It is how we unleash diversity in ways that allow people to grow together. And I mean, I think we are all deeply troubled by the polarization in American life right now. And, you know, the roughness, the coarseness of so much political discourse in this country. And so I want diversity to propel us to this better place, to this stronger place, you know, this health, this place of healing. And I don't necessarily see that in all spheres. So, you know, to Nasreen's point, that what I was, you know, explaining in the theater community wasn't necessarily reflected, you know, on the ground. Let's try and build that, you know, let's work toward, and that doesn't all mean we think alike or, you know, speak the same language, literally, metaphorically, figuratively. But, you know, I do think that most people are curious. And I think that people like to step out of whatever box they've been put into. I think we are all very complex, and we also embody our own contradictions. So I say, let's run with that, you know, and love it. And we can't predetermine the outcome, right? We don't know that end game. We don't even know if the destination is a destination or just a way station to somewhere else, you know, but I think that is the mindset, the attitude that I hope we can embrace.
Jamil, I really appreciate that thought. Anthony, but I love to just tie this bow and then let you go ahead and close this thing up. Because the thing that Jamil's group was pointing at was that he got a group together, and then what they did was stop doing the one thing I asked earlier, was they stopped doing the harm thing, to harm to the anti-Blackness. So our doing harm to each other is just a learned adaptation to the oppression that we've had all along. So we are harsh on each other the way the oppressors are to us. If we simply give up doing harm to each other, we are disrupting white supremacy in a huge way. And your group is an example of that. And so we have to keep one foot in that possibility and one foot in the real world, and then see if we can't bring the real world closer to where you are, Jim, with that adjacent future. So thank you for that. Anthony, I didn't mean to step on your toes there, but thank you so much for letting me put that comment in.
Marcus, you can step on my toes anytime you want. It's one of my favorite things, because then I know that we're chopping it up together and you're close to me. Jamil and Fouad, Roxane, thank you so much for gracing us with your lifetime's worth of wisdom and experience. And when we overlap our wisdom and experience, we can really change and come together. So appreciate your time tonight. And also, you know, making this film and sharing it, Jamil and Roxane especially.
Thank you for the invitation.
Thank
you.
Well,
we'll have to do it again, Jamil. More to come between Collaboration and Silk Road Rising as we overlap our missions. And you know, I did want to echo the thing about, we talked about storytelling. Let us not forget the magic that happens when you lose yourself in another person's story. There's a thing that's inexplainable where you start to see the world through somebody else's eyes and shoes. And that is the magic of storytelling, and it's the magic of theater. And I have read many a script on a flat white piece of paper and had no idea what was happening. And then I've seen actors do it in front of me, and it was as if I was living in a 4D hologram of an actual thing. And I forgot I was living in that hologram, and I actually started to change. And I have sure changed a lot in these 25 years at Collaboration. And I want to thank you all for helping me change a little bit today with this really nuanced conversation about whiteness. Thank you to our guests. We're going to go ahead and move on with our final credits now. That was amazing. Please go to the Facebook Becoming group to add yourself to that conversation, and commit to an anti-racist action that you're going to take over the next month. I do want to thank all of our old timers like Andy Swindler and Professor Tony Dunbar and David Cherry, Carla Stillwell. A lot of our Becoming folks came and got a special treat tonight of this incredible content. We are going to show a special trailer at the end of the film today, the program today, for a project called Encounter Englewood. Collaboration will be premiering our Peace Book film festival, if COVID allows, on September 25th and October 2nd, where we'll be screening some films we made over the pandemic, including Encounter Englewood, about 5 real change leaders in Englewood, and Oh Colonizers by Carla Stillwell. We have a bunch of great peace talks, and we will be shooting all that with 3 cameras. So if you don't make it to the live show, stay on the lookout for that later this summer.
Yeah, so many great things are going on, and all of them because of people like you. So thank you, everybody, for coming tonight. And we want to thank our program sponsors, because this programming on Collaborations Together Network is made possible by the support of our sponsors like AV Chicago, the Mark and Jeannie Malnati Family Foundation, the Joseph and Bessie Feinberg Foundation, and our season sponsors, and people just like you who can make a one-time donation at collaboration.org, or you can sign up to be a Collaborativist for as little as $1 a month. So thank you all. We'll see you again here first Tuesday next month.
Thank you, everybody. We're going to go ahead and run that film from Encounter Englewood, and everyone have a wonderful night. Wrap yourself up in a story.
Good night. Thank you.
Thank you.
Englewood, Chicago is a training grounds for people to change the rest of the world.
And there's a reason why people love Englewood. It has a lot of style, it has a lot of history, it has a lot of culture.
It's really important that we go outside of our neighborhoods.
And I realize in this work, it's not just about issues that affect you. It's about fighting for issues that affect your friends and affect your family and affect your neighbor. And that's, again, community.
All the different things that I do are just tools to create the environment that I want to see.
As things turned out and as my career turned out, I'm in a certain position where I can help people economically, I can mentor them career-wise.
You know, there's nobody else who's more qualified to do it than we are, because we live here and we know what we need. We just need the resources to get it done.
Englewood is no different than everybody else. So
when you provide people with what they need to thrive, they thrive, right? It's as simple as that.